Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on Women and Work, some reflections on medieval India, part 2. In this lecture, I would be talking about the wide variety of roles that were performed by women, both in the household as well as in the public domain. The household was not a private space strictly speaking, for it also included a large number of production activities that are usually consigned to the public space. Women's labor was crucial in these spheres of production as well, and this is a very important aspect that we need to take into consideration. An informal market space had not as yet developed in the medieval period. Most economic activities were crucially related to and even integrated with the household, where women's labor was both qualitatively and quantitatively higher than the labor of men. So, when we are talking about the putting out system of the pre-industrial societies, we must keep this aspect in mind. So, women sustained all economic activities without even receiving due credit for the same. Among the important activities, their participation in handling cattle, milk and butter has a number of references in a number of illustrations in Miftah Fuzula, which shows a woman sitting and churning buttermilk. Then we have a source in Khair ul Majlis which points towards women earning her livelihood through her cow. Then in Razma Nama also there is an illustration dated 1585 CE, which again depicted women making butter and carrying milk as well as buttermilk. As you can see in these Pahari paintings, these women are carrying pitchers on their head, which were probably butter or buttermilk or related items. However, when we are talking about the wide variety of functions that were performed by women, one also needs to incorporate an understanding about caste connotations, because the nature of women's work in the household had caste connotations. Not all women performed similar work in the household. So, while we had Kayastha women who only performed household chores and their prime duty was to serve their family members, unlike the Khatris, they did not touch the spinning wheel and also shunned other similar production activities. Talking about slavery, slaves constituted another very important external element in the household. So, when we are talking about household, one has to mention the element of slavery. As has been pointed out by Burney, the subjects were so obedient that they paid tax even by selling their wives and children. So, a large number of women were kind of exposed to slavery due to a number of compulsions that the family must have gone through. So, we also have sources like Vijneshwara who have mentioned 15 types of slaves, and there were different sources for procuring slavery, and one very important source was of course warfare, and other very important source was market, where these slaves were freely bought and sold. And it was Alauddin Khalji who passed a number of regulations for slaves, and he kind of organized buying and selling of slaves by fixing their rates. The difference in the price of a slave girl was caused by her specialization or her refinement or her age, and there are references to female slaves in a number of sale deeds that are mentioned in Lekha Paddhati. A slave girl was used as a prostitute and the master earned money through them frequently. Then there were a number of Sufis or Darwish who also kept slave girls and even taught them prayers and the right code of conduct. Masalik also points towards refinement of manners as well as dexterity that was very important if a slave girl had to be groomed. However, when we are talking about slave women, we also must mention the complexity of relations. The relationship between the female slaves and the women of the household was a very complex one because the former enjoyed sexual intimacy with the male head, and so jealousy was quite common in such situations. And we also have a reference to Sheikh Nasiruddin Chirag, who told one of the female disciple Murid that she could become his disciple if she behaved well with her slaves. So women of the household had to kind of tolerate their constant interference in their married life as well. Now, talking about the institution of concubinage, this became some kind of a social instrument for integrating the captive women into the household of their masters. And there are several documents in the National Archives of India which mention the sale and purchase of such women, and also that transaction was usually tax free. Now, the household labor also included the service of several other kinds of women, like a wet nurse as well as a midwife. Midwifery was typical of a woman's work and was also largely underpaid, and it was usually relegated for lower caste women because it was considered to be a polluting task. So therefore, caste definitely had an important influence as far as the work of women was concerned. Now, talking about wet nursing, lactating mothers often sold their milk to elites, and almost all women of ruling and elite families required the services of the wet nurse. In a polity where becoming a mother was the most important act that one lady had to perform, the availability of such nurses was very critical for the survival and for healthy growth of an infant. Now, when we are talking about women in medieval context, we also must mention the influence of parda on women's work. There is no direct evidence to reveal the contemporary perception of women's work, but indirect evidence is provided by the institution of parda and also the spatial arrangement of houses in medieval India. Parda could be comprehended as a social and a historical phenomenon of segregation, and the culture of parda represented the confinement of females not just within the house but within its deepest recesses. So women were supposed to be in the innermost compartment of the house, and the houses usually had very high walls in order to avoid any kind of outside glance falling into the house. Parda was not just an Islamic institution, however, and it was adopted by Hindus at the time of even before that and even later on. So it was not as if it got an encouragement only after Muslim invasion. It was an elaborate means of signaling obedience. So when we are talking about parda, it also means focusing on the separation of women from their male in-laws, while the Muslim culture kept sexually mature women, married or otherwise, apart from society and other male family members at large. So, what was the impact of this institution of parda on the functioning of females in the family? One aspect that can be discussed is that of devaluation of household work due to invisibility. It did not require women folk to withdraw from labor on family farms or elsewhere, because ultimately in the family farms it was poor women belonging to the marginalized castes and communities who were functioning. So, due to parda, the work performed in the fields continued, or in the public sphere continued. However, the work performed in the house got unnoticed, and all the more household work was further devalued due to its invisibility. In the peasant economy, in which women provided an indispensable source of labor and hence could not be kept secluded, there was always a scope for accommodating women by allowing them to work but in veil. So, women could move about and earn their living, as has been pointed out by Dagmar Engels in the work Beyond Parda, Women in Bengal. Then one can also talk about class differentiation, as I have just mentioned, that for poorer sections, parda did not hinder women's laboring potential, and it also exposed the apparent distinction between the two groups of women. In fact, it widened further the gap between the two, the high class who were supposed to be parda nashin, and the lower class women who could openly work in the fields, and they had to work in order to keep their households in better shape. So, if we talk about the residential arrangements, the home was internally differentiated by gender. The analysis of residential arrangements has thrown light on the limitations that were imposed by the patrilineal society on women. As has been pointed out by Trevernier, all the houses of private persons had large enclosures, in the middle of which was the dwelling, so that no one could approach the woman's residence. Houses were usually separated from each other, and they were concealed by the height of walls, specifically to hide women. The study of the houses of aristocracy has also indicated that these were surrounded by a boundary wall that was provided with a well guarded door. If we talk about the size and height of the door, then this also was an indicator of the social status of the occupant. A very important construction was that of the deori, which was a passage which took 2 to 3 sharp bends, and the intention here of making a deori was to foil any kind of attempt to look into the house, and this became a characteristic feature of most of the upper class houses. So, when we are comparing this with the public spaces, the poorer women and men mingled in bazaars or the village green patches. As has been pointed out by Foster, the ordinary women kind of were free to appear in public, and those of the higher classes were never seen in public, nor was it kind of considered natural to speak of females in the public domain if those females belong to the upper sections of society. However, we do have so many references to transgressing of boundaries. So, female segregation in medieval India indeed did not prevent women either from participating in work activities, or even from exercising some degree of control over their resources and even property. Then we also have references to women playing the role of guards and as well as spies. So apart from the household chores, women also worked across different functions and capabilities. They imparted duty of watchguards, looked after the harem's security, whereas inside the harem they were employed to keep a record of its income, expenditure, organization, maintenance, etc. As has been pointed out by Ibn Battuta, the emperors of India employed slave girls who acted as spies for the Sultan, and these women spies definitely kept an eye on the amirs. They acted as state informers, informing the Sultan about the minutest detail of the day-to-day development of the Sultanate. One can also study the role played by women in managing their resources, and for this we can talk about the study conducted by Kanak Latha Mukund, who has studied property rights in South India, where we get inscriptional references to women making donating gifts to temples, sale, and also assignment of property or land revenues. The 17th century records from Awadh also show women inheriting, selling, or disposing of their milkiyat rights. So there was no law as such either in Hindu or Muslim jurisprudence which kind of excluded women from sharing their wealth or distributing their wealth or donating. And ordinary women did control property and participated in the maintenance and organization as well. There are a number of documents from Surat which throw light on yet another aspect where she could lay a claim at meher after being a widow. So there was some kind of awareness among medieval women about their rights as well. Then one must mention the important role that women played as builders, and women maintained from their own expenses certain buildings as palaces, tombs, mosques, bazaars and wells. And there is an inscription dated 1176 known as the Lal Rai stone inscription from Gujarat, which has highlighted that how Rajputras while they were making a grant co-jointly with Queen Mahibala Devi for celebrating festivals. So these kind of indulgences, involvements of women must be talked about when we are talking about the important role played by women in medieval India. Then of course we have references to Sultan Razia, who kind of patronized Madrasa-e Nasiriya. Then Maham Anga's important role in giving shape to Khairal Mawazil Mosque as well as a madrasa in 1561. C.B. Asher has also pointed out and brought to light the important activities of Jahan Ara and Roshnara, who got constructed several gardens, sarais, etc. in Shahjahanabad. The control of women over funds as well as labor signifies authority, and it also shows that how women found out ways and means to kind of defy patriarchy, though these were few exceptions. Now, in this folio that you can see on the screen from Akbarnama, you can see women carrying some kind of a construction material on their heads. So they were playing a very important role as laborers, as masons who were participating in the building projects of the empire. And in this particular visual captured the building of Akbar's capital of Fatehpur Sikri, where women are shown performing tasks like breaking stones, old bricks, and pounding to prepare rubble, as well as mixing bitumen, mortar, cement, and also straining and mixing lime. So they are carrying such material in the pans, held in hand or over their heads, and they were probably handing over this material to the masons. So as construction workers, we have a number of other inscriptional evidences also. For example, from Rajasthan, dated 1597, where during the construction of a step well, the number of men who were employed versus women who were employed is mentioned, and the number of women was much more than the number of men, which was 171. So as has been pointed out by Elphinstone, he had nowhere seen the employment of women in building industry as he had seen in India. So this was some kind of an exception for something of an exceptional visual for him, and this also shows the kind of work that these women, multitaskers that they were. Then women also played very important role as salt makers, and most of the salt makers took help of their wives in the making as well as marketing of salt. There was both men, women, boys and girls who were usually employed at various furnaces also for 6 months, and women invariably helped their husbands in blowing bellows and dragging hot iron from the furnace. So therefore, we have a number of references, number of examples which indicate that how these women were performing the so-called hard tasks. In both agricultural and non-agricultural sectors, women were performing work that required much harder strength, stamina as well as energy. So one example that can be given is that of the transplantation of paddy, which is a very tedious task. It requires bending for long hours, and similarly pounding of bricks is also a very hard activity. So while women were performing all these tasks, there did exist the age-old biases, and the age-old explanation for women's works attempted to rationalize an age-old tradition of gendered inequality. The assumption that women are physically weak in a culturally defined position rather than a biologically stated fact, and this also serves to perpetuate gender hierarchy, and it also places obstacles in the ways of women's participation in both skilled as well as better paid jobs. And sadly, the situation even some time back and even in contemporary times continues to remain the same. However, the change has started coming about now. The gendered basis of wage difference and the exclusion of women from certain skilled and classified jobs in medieval India shows the extent of patriarchal domination in the economic domain. They also indicate a reality of medieval history, that of the ability of the patriarchal social structure to appropriate women's labor without letting women benefit from it socially, culturally, economically as well as politically. So we can say that in an agrarian economy with a patrilineal kinship structure, the labor is the most important resource after land, and in such a system, control and use of both land and labor are generally governed by patrilineal principles. So women's labor is subsumed within the domestic mode of production, preventing them from gaining much out of their work. Social benefits from their productive role in economy, therefore do not really accrue to them. The subsistence level economy with total dependence on intensive family labor for cultivation further makes this process difficult for them. And while women were such an economic asset, however, they were not rewarded or even acknowledged for the work that they were performing. So, what was the reason behind this? One important reason, of course, was male ownership of the means of production. The loom symbolized male ownership, as was the case with the plough. And as has been pointed out by Vijaya Ramaswamy, women were not allowed to touch loom because of this concept of ritual purity. Men's control over machines which help in the production process needs to be studied. So, for example, loom could be a way to ensure the dominance of male over the production process and to appropriate women's labor in the service of patriarchy. So, the commercial production combined with domestic putting out system led to a sharply defined hierarchy of specialized function. So, the father or the master was at the head of the household with a hierarchy of women who were beneath him, and this structure was based on the supremacy of males because the basis for future, and it also became the basis for future hierarchical divisions in society. So, the household, which is considered to be the domain of non-work, is the place where much of women's labor was deployed. However, they were not adequately compensated, and what they experienced and still experience is devaluation, and this devaluation had sexual as well as symbolic dimensions which must be further researched on. Thanks a lot.